The biting Alaskan wind whipped my face as I drove along the winding road that took me back to Whitefall, my hometown. 16 years have passed since I left, vowing never to return. But here I am, James Anderson, 42-year-old ex-cop, with more emotional scars than I care to admit, returning to the epicenter of my worst memories. The familiar landscape paraded past the car window, snow-covered pine trees, imposing mountains in the background, and, occasionally, a solitary house bravely enduring the eternal winter. Every kilometer I drove made my stomach squirm with anticipation. The bare trees seemed to whisper the names of those we lost on that fateful night so many years ago. As I approached the town, I noticed that little had changed. The same wooden houses, now a little more weathered, still lined the snow-covered streets. The "Welcome to Whitefall" sign was crooked and faded, as if the town itself had lost the spirit to welcome visitors. I parked in front of the only hotel in town, the same one I used to stay in as a child during summers with my grandparents. The receptionist, a gray-haired lady I didn't recognize, gave me a suspicious look as I entered. I realized she wasn't the only one. The few locals who passed by watched me with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Name?" asked the receptionist, her voice as cold as the air outside. "James Anderson," I replied, trying to smile but failing miserably. His eyes widened for a moment, and I could see recognition flash across his face. "Oh, well, welcome back," she said, her voice now a little softer, but still cautious. I took the room key and climbed the creaking stairs. The room was simple, with a single bed, a desk and a window overlooking the main street. I sat on the bed, feeling the weight of years and memories pulling me down. I couldn't stay still for long. Restlessness drove me outside, and soon I found myself walking towards the town cemetery. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of the snow beneath my feet. I reached the iron gates and hesitated for a moment before entering. The gravestones were partially covered in snow, but I easily found the ones I was looking for. My parents, my younger sister, all lost that night. I stood there, feeling the cold penetrate to my bones, but unable to move. Words got stuck in my throat as I tried to formulate some kind of excuse, some kind of explanation for my long absence. It was then that I felt it. That unsettling feeling of being watched. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly turned around, expecting to see someone. But there was no one there, just the silent gravestones and the softly falling snow. I left the cemetery with hurried steps, my heart pounding in my chest. The streets were almost deserted, but I could feel the glances behind the curtains, the hushed whispers behind closed doors. Whitefall guarded its secrets jealously, and I was about to unearth them, whether the city wanted me to or not. I walked aimlessly until I found myself in front of the town's old cafe. Through the fogged-up window, I saw a familiar figure. Sarah, my childhood friend, now a woman scarred by time and pain, just like me. Our gazes met, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the past in her eyes. I took a deep breath and opened the cafe door. The bell tinkled, announcing my arrival, and all eyes turned to me. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood up slowly, her face a mixture of emotions that I couldn't quite decipher. "James," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "You're back." I nodded, unable to form words. Sarah approached and, to my surprise, hugged me. It was a brief hug, but full of meaning. When we parted, I saw unshed tears in her eyes. "We have a lot to talk about," she said, indicating a table in the corner. I sat down, feeling the weight of the other customers' stares. Sarah ordered 2 coffees and sat down opposite me. For a moment, we sat in silence, years of untold stories hanging between us. "Why now, James?" she finally asked. "After all this time?" I looked down at my hands, searching for the right words. "Because it's time to face the past, Sarah. To find out the truth about what happened that night. I can't live with these unanswered questions any longer." Sarah nodded slowly, a glint of determination appearing in her eyes. "So you're finally ready to dig deep into Whitefall's secrets?" "I am," I replied, feeling a mixture of fear and resolve. And I need your help. She reached across the table, taking my hand firmly. I'm with you, James. But I warn you, what we discover could change everything. As the coffee cooled in front of us, we began to plan our investigation, unaware that we were about to unleash forces that had long been sleeping under the snow of Whitefall. The next morning dawned with a dense fog covering Whitefall, as if the city itself wanted to hide from us. I woke up to the distant sound of sirens, a ghostly echo from the past that made me sit up in bed, sweaty and panting. For a moment, I was disoriented, until the reality of my mission hit me again. I found Sarah waiting for me at the hotel reception. Her eyes were marked by deep, dark circles, a sign that she hadn't slept well either. We exchanged a silent look of understanding before heading out into the icy streets of Whitefall. Where do we start? I asked, as we walked side by side, our breaths forming small clouds in the cold air. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. I think we should start with Mr. Hargrove. He was the librarian at the time, and he always seemed to know more than he was saying. I nodded, remembering the old librarian with his shrewd eyes and enigmatic smile. We headed towards the municipal library, a Victorian building that seemed out of place among the more rustic constructions of the city. As we entered, the familiar smell of old books and polished wood hit me like a wave. Mr. Hargrove was sitting behind the service counter, his half-moon glasses balanced precariously on the tip of his nose. He raised his eyes as we approached, and I could see recognition and a hint of fear in his gaze. "James Anderson," he said, his voice trembling. "And Sarah Mitchell, what a surprise to see you two together again." "Mr. Hargrove," I greeted, trying to keep my voice casual. "We're doing some research into Whitefall's recent history. We thought you might be able to help us." The old librarian looked around nervously before leaning forward. "You're touching dangerous things, children," he whispered. "Some truths are better left buried in the snow." Sarah approached, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Hargrove, we need to know what really happened that night." The old man sighed deeply, seeming to age 10 years before our eyes. "It was an experiment," he finally said. "Something that should never have happened in our small town." My heart raced. "What kind of experiment?" "I don't know all the details," he replied, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "But it involved the government, scientists, and the human mind. I've heard rumors about mind control, memory manipulation, things that sound like something out of a science fiction movie." Sarah and I exchanged alarmed glances. "Where can we find more information about this?" I asked. Mr. Hargrove hesitated again before standing up slowly. "Come with me," he said, leading us to the back of the library. In a small, dusty room, he removed some books from a shelf, revealing a secret compartment. From there, he took out a yellowed folder. "This is all I managed to save before they cleaned everything out," he said, handing me the folder with trembling hands. "But be careful. Knowing the truth has its price." I took the folder, feeling not only its physical weight, but also the weight of the revelations it might contain. Sarah put her hand on my shoulder, her presence anchoring me in the moment. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," said Sarah. "I promise we'll be discreet." We left the library with the precious briefcase hidden inside my coat. The cold wind seemed sharper now, laden with the promise of secrets about to be revealed. We decided to go to the hotel room to examine the documents in privacy. As we walked, I couldn't help but notice that we were being watched. Shadowy figures on street corners, curtains that closed quickly as we passed. The whole city seemed to be watching us. In the bedroom, we closed the curtains and spread out the documents on the bed. They were a mixture of official reports, handwritten notes, and even some black and white photographs. As we read, a disturbing picture began to form. "James, look at this," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly as she passed me a document. It was a report detailing the test subjects for the experiment. My blood ran cold when I saw familiar names on the list, including members of my own family. "My God," I whispered, They've used the whole town as guinea pigs. Sarah nodded somberly. And it looks like the experiment got out of hand that night. But why? What went wrong? We continued to examine the documents, each revelation more shocking than the last. Mentions of mass conditioning, memory implantation, and suppression of free will leapt off the pages, painting a picture of scientific horror beyond our wildest imagination. One document in particular caught my eye. It was an order to carry out the experiment, signed by someone whose name was painfully familiar to me, Chief William Reeves, the man who had been my mentor in the police. "Sarah," I said, my voice hoarse with shock, "Chief Reeves, he was involved in all this." She took the document from my trembling hands, her eyes widening as she read, "James, that changes everything. If the police chief was involved, then the entire power structure of the city could be compromised," I concluded, the realization hitting me like a punch in the gut. We were silent for a moment, the weight of our discoveries hanging over us. The distant sound of a siren made us jump, paranoia settling in our minds. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice a mixture of fear and determination. I looked at her, feeling a resolve forming inside me. "We keep digging. We need to find out how far it goes, who else is involved, and most importantly, if it's still going on." Sarah nodded, a fierce glint in her eyes. "I'm with you, James, all the way." As night fell over Whitefall, we began to plan our next move. The shadows seemed to lengthen around us, and I couldn't help feeling that we were getting deeper into something much bigger and more dangerous than we could ever have imagined. The snow continued to fall outside, silent and relentless, covering Whitefall's secrets in a blanket of white. But now we knew that beneath that seemingly pure surface lurked horrors that threatened to emerge and swallow us all. The morning arrived with blinding clarity, the snow reflecting the winter sun with an almost painful intensity. I woke up startled, the images of the documents we had discovered still dancing in my mind. Sarah had stayed in my room until late at night, both of us absorbed in our investigation, weaving theories and drawing connections. An insistent sound brought me out of my thoughts. Someone was knocking on the bedroom door. Cautiously, I approached, my heart racing. "Who is it?" I asked, my hand instinctively reaching for a gun that was no longer there. "It's me, James. Open up quickly." Sarah's urgent voice made me act immediately. As soon as I opened the door, Sarah rushed in, her eyes wide with worry. "We've got problems," she said breathlessly. "Mr. Hargrove has disappeared." I felt my stomach sink. "What? What do you mean he's disappeared?" "I went to the library this morning to ask some more questions," Sarah explained, pacing back and forth in the small room. "But he wasn't there. His assistant said he didn't show up for work and isn't answering his phone." I ran my hand over my face, feeling my stubble. "That can't be a coincidence," Sarah nodded somberly. "I think someone found out that he helped us. James, what if—" She didn't need to finish her sentence. The fear that something had happened to Mr. Hargrove hung heavy over us. "We need to act quickly," I said, getting dressed. "Let's go to his house." The drive to Mr. Hargrove's residence was tense. Every glance from a passerby seemed to be filled with suspicion. The small blue wooden house was silent when we arrived, a thin layer of untouched snow covering the entrance. We exchanged a worried glance before knocking on the door. No answer. I tried the handle and, to our surprise, the door opened with an ominous creak. The inside of the house was in complete chaos. Books and papers scattered everywhere, drawers open, furniture out of place. It looked as if a hurricane had passed through, or someone was desperately looking for something. "My God," Sarah whispered, putting her hand to her mouth. Cautiously, we searched the house, but there was no sign of Mr. Hargrove. In the study, we found more evidence of a frantic search, but something caught my eye, a partially burnt piece of paper in the fireplace. Carefully, I removed the fragment. On it, I could make out a few words: Project Eco and Underground Base. "Sarah, look at this," I called, showing her the paper. "I think we've found our next clue." She examined the fragment, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Underground Base, do you think—" A noise from the front of the house interrupted us. We froze in place, exchanging alarmed glances. Heavy footsteps were approaching. Without thinking twice, I pulled Sarah behind a bookcase. We had barely hidden when two men in dark suits entered the office. Their faces were hard, impassive, instantly reminding me of federal agents I'd met in my days as a police officer. "Go through everything again," said one of them, his voice cold and metallic. "The old man must have left something else around here." As the men rummaged through the office, Sarah and I hardly dared to breathe. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Who were these men? What exactly were they looking for? After what seemed like an eternity, the men finally left. We waited a few more minutes before daring to leave our hiding place. "We need to get out of here," I whispered to Sarah. "Now." We left Mr. Hargrove's house as discreetly as possible, our hearts pounding in our chests. The streets of Whitefall looked different now, every shadow potentially hiding a threat. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. I thought for a moment, weighing up our options. "I know someone who can help us," she finally said. "My sister, Mia." Sarah looked at me in surprise. Mia? But she didn't. Died that night? That's what everyone thinks, I added. But no, I managed to get her out of town soon after the incident. She's living under an assumed name in a cabin on the outskirts of Whitefall. Sarah's eyes widened at the revelation. "James, why didn't you ever tell me this?" I felt a pang of guilt. To protect you, and to protect you too. The fewer people who knew, the safer she would be. Sarah was silent for a moment, processing the information. "And you think she can help us?" I nodded. Mia has always had special abilities, intuitions, premonitions. After that night, they became stronger. Maybe she can give us some direction about this underground base. We decided to leave immediately. As we drove away from Whitefall towards the snowy mountains, I couldn't help feeling that we were crossing a point of no return. Mia's cabin was hidden in a remote valley, surrounded by tall pine trees. When we arrived, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I knocked on the door, my heart racing. After a moment, it opened, revealing a woman with dark hair and intense eyes. "Mia." "James," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and resignation. "I knew you'd come. I saw it in my dreams." As we entered the cozy cabin, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The walls were covered in strange drawings and symbols I didn't recognize. Mia led us into the living room, where a fire crackled, chasing away the cold. "You're looking for answers," she said. Not a question, but a statement. Sarah and I looked at each other before nodding. "Mia," I began, "we need to know about Project Echo and an underground base." My sister's eyes widened for a moment, a flash of fear passing through them. "The echo," she whispered. "It never stops resounding." She stood up abruptly, walking over to one of the walls covered in drawings. With a broad gesture, she indicated a series of intricate symbols. "This," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "is a map to the underground base. I drew it in one of my trances." Sarah and I approached, studying the complex symbols. Slowly, I began to recognize familiar shapes, the mountains around Whitefall, the frozen lake, and something else. "Here," Mia pointed to a symbol that looked like a spiral. "That's the entrance. Hidden in the depths of the old abandoned mine." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The old mine was a place avoided by everyone in the city, supposedly because of the danger of cave-ins. But now... "Mia," Sarah asked softly, "what exactly is Project Echo?" My sister turned to us, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "It's an experiment to control minds, to create echoes of thoughts that resonate through an entire population. And Whitefall is just the beginning." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of these revelations. I looked at Sarah, seeing in her the same mixture of fear and determination that I felt. "We need to go there," she finally said. "We need to see for ourselves." Mia nodded gravely. "I knew you'd say that, but James, Sarah, be careful." What you find there could change everything. As we prepared for our journey to the abandoned mine, I couldn't help feeling that we were on the brink of something far greater and more terrible than we could ever have imagined. The echoes of the past were about to turn into a deafening scream, and I feared that we were not prepared for what was to come. The entrance to the old mine loomed before us like the mouth of some primordial beast, dark and menacing. The wind howled through the surrounding trees, carrying with it snowflakes that danced in the icy air. Sarah and I looked at each other, the determination in our eyes masking the fear we both felt. "Are you sure about this, James?" Sarah asked, her voice almost swallowed by the wind. I nodded gravely. "We have no choice. The answers we're looking for are down there." With flashlights in hand and backpacks on our backs, we ventured into the darkness of the mine. The smell of damp earth and oxidized metal immediately enveloped us. Our footsteps echoed off the rocky walls, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. We followed the map Mia had drawn, descending deeper and deeper into the bowels of the earth. At every turn, at every fork in the road, I felt that we were moving away not only from the surface, but also from the reality we knew. After what seemed like an eternity of walking, we came to a dead end. A smooth rocky wall loomed before us, seemingly insurmountable. "It can't be," I muttered, consulting Mia's map again. "There should be something here." Sarah examined the wall carefully, her flashlight illuminating every inch of the rock. Suddenly, she gasped, "James, look at this!" I moved closer to see what she had found. Almost imperceptibly carved into the stone was a symbol identical to the one Mia had drawn to represent the entrance to the base. "How do we open that?" Sarah asked, running her fingers over the symbol. Before I could answer, a mechanical noise echoed through the cave. The rock wall began to move, sliding aside to reveal a hidden passage. We exchanged a look of astonishment before cautiously moving forward. The passage led to a metallic corridor, illuminated by fluorescent lights that flashed intermittently. The contrast with the natural cave was shocking. We were definitely in uncharted territory now. We advanced down the corridor, our footsteps echoing disturbingly in the metal. We came to a large circular room, full of electronic equipment and computer screens. In the center was a structure that resembled a glass chamber, big enough to hold a person. "My God," Sarah whispered, her eyes scanning the room. "What is all this?" I approached one of the computers, trying to make sense of the information on the screen. Complex graphs and sequences of numbers paraded rapidly. "It looks like some kind of brain mapping," I said, more to myself than to Sarah, "but on a scale I've never seen before." Sarah was examining some documents on a nearby table. "James, look at this," she called, her voice trembling. I took the papers she held out to me, my heart racing as I read. It was a list of names, Whitefall residents. Next to each name, there were cryptic notes: high susceptibility, moderate resistance, complete synchronization. "They were classifying people," Sarah said, horrified, like guinea pigs. We continued to search the room, each discovery more disturbing than the last. We found reports detailing mass mind synchronization experiments, protocols for implanting collective memories, and most alarmingly, plans to expand Project Echo to other cities. "Sarah," I said, my voice hoarse with shock, "this is much bigger than we imagined. They're not just trying to control Whitefall. They're planning something on a national scale, maybe even global." She nodded gravely, her face pale in the cold light of the fluorescent lamps. "But why? What's the end goal of all this?" Before I could answer, a sound alerted us. Footsteps. Someone was coming. We quickly hid behind a large server. Seconds later, 2 figures entered the room. I recognized one of them immediately. It was Chief Reeves, my old mentor. The other was a man I had never seen before, wearing a lab coat. "The results are promising, Doctor," Reeves was saying. "The synchronization rate in Whitefall has reached 85%. We're ready for the next phase." The man in the lab coat nodded, a cold smile on his lips. "Excellent. With Whitefall as our model of success, we'll be able to convince the higher-ups to expand the project. Imagine, Chief Reeves, an entire nation thinking in unison, acting as one organism." I felt my blood run cold. What they were planning was nothing less than the annihilation of free will on a massive scale. Reeves seemed to hesitate for a moment. What about the side effects, the disappearances, the unexplained deaths? The scientist made a dismissive gesture. Inevitable side effects. The final benefit outweighs any individual loss. I had to hold Sarah back to stop her jumping out of our hiding place. Her eyes glowed with fury and horror. The two men continued their conversation while checking the equipment. They talked about synchronization pulses, mental anchors, and descent suppression. Every word was a terrible revelation of the nightmare they were orchestrating. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they left the room. Sarah and I waited a few minutes before daring to come out of our hiding place. "We need to expose this," Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We need to stop them." I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. Yes, but how? Who would believe us? It was then that I noticed something in the glass chamber in the center of the room. There was a control panel next to it, with a prominent red button labeled Emergency Pulse. "Sarah," I called out, a crazy idea forming in my mind. What if we could use their own system against them? A pulse to wake people up instead of controlling them. She looked at me, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Do you think we can reverse the process?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but it might be our only chance." We approached the control panel, aware that what we were about to do could change everything, for better or for worse. "James," Sarah said softly, placing her hand on mine as I prepared to press the button, "no matter what happens, we're in this together." I looked into her eyes, seeing reflected there the same mixture of fear and determination that I felt. With a nod, I pressed the button. A low hum began to emanate from the chamber, gradually increasing in intensity. The lights in the room flickered, and the computers around us began to display frantic sequences of data. Suddenly, a wave of invisible energy seemed to sweep through the room. I felt as if something had passed through me, leaving me momentarily disoriented. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. "Did you feel that?" she asked, panting. Before I could answer, a deafening alarm began to sound. Red lights flashed all over the room. "We've got to get out of here," I shouted above the noise. We ran back down the metal corridor, the sound of approaching boots echoing behind us. We reached the cave passage just in time to see the door begin to close. With one last, desperate effort, we threw ourselves through the opening, rolling onto the rocky floor of the cave as the door closed with a final bang behind us. Gasping and trembling, we stood up. The silence of the cave was almost deafening after the chaos of the base. "Did we make it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But whatever we did, there's no going back now." We began our journey back to the surface, each step taking us closer to a world that, we were sure, would never be the same again. What exactly we had unleashed, only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The echoes of what happened in that underground base would reverberate for a long time, not just in Whitefall, but perhaps throughout the world. As we approached the mine's exit, a strange light began to seep through the opening. It wasn't the cold winter's daylight we were expecting, but a pulsating, almost supernatural glow. "James," Sarah whispered, grabbing my arm. "What's that?" We emerged from the mine into a transformed world. The sky above Whitefall was illuminated by waves of light, similar to an aurora borealis, but in colors I had never seen before. And in the air, almost imperceptibly, there was a low, constant hum. We exchanged a look of astonishment and apprehension. Whatever we had done in the underground base, its effects were only just beginning to show, and I had a feeling that our journey to discover the truth about Whitefall was far from over. The world we encountered on leaving the mine was surreal. The sky pulsed with impossible colors, waves of light dancing over Whitefall like an ethereal cloak. The air vibrated with a palpable energy, carrying a low hum that seemed to resonate in our bones. Sarah and I exchanged looks of astonishment and apprehension. "What have we done, James?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Before I could reply, a scream cut through the air. We turned quickly to see a staggering figure emerging from the nearby trees. It was a woman, her eyes wide and unfocused, her hands pressed against her temples. "Make it stop!" she shouted, falling to her knees in the snow. The voices, so many voices. We ran to her, Sarah kneeling beside her while I watched the surroundings, fearing that someone from the base might follow us. "It's okay," Sarah murmured, trying to calm the woman down. "You're safe now." The woman grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength. "No, you don't understand," she said, her eyes finally focusing on us. "I can hear all of them, everyone in the city, their thoughts, their memories. It's all mixed up in my head." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The pulse we had activated hadn't simply undone the mind control. It seemed to have opened up some kind of psychic connection between the inhabitants of Whitefall. "We need to get back to town," I said, helping Sarah lift the woman. "We have to see what's going on." The drive back to Whitefall was surreal. We met more people wandering through the forest, all in different states of confusion and distress. Some mumbled incoherently, others shouted the names of people who had long since left. It was as if the entire population was experiencing a collective, chaotic awakening. When we finally reached the city limits, the scene that greeted us was one of pure chaos. People were running through the streets, some laughing hysterically, others crying in despair. I saw neighbors staring at each other with a mixture of recognition and horror, as if they were seeing each other for the first time. "It's like all mental barriers have collapsed," Sarah muttered, her eyes scanning the scene before us. We moved down the main street, trying to make sense of the chaos. It was then that I saw a familiar figure staggering out of the police station, Chief Reeves. His face was pale, his eyes injected with a terror I had never seen before. When his gaze met mine, he stopped, frozen. "Anderson," he said, his voice hoarse. "What have you done?" I approached him, feeling a mixture of anger and pity. "What did we do, Chief? I think the question is what you did. With this whole town." Reeves staggered, leaning on the wall of the building. "You don't understand," he muttered. "It was for the greater good, to create a perfect society, in harmony." "Harmony?" Sarah intervened, her voice shaking with anger. "Look around you. Does that look like harmony to you?" The boss let out a bitter laugh. "That's just the beginning, the initial chaos. But soon everyone will synchronize. We'll be one." His eyes suddenly widened, as if he was seeing something that wasn't there. "No," he whispered. "No, please. I didn't know. I didn't." With an anguished cry, Reeves collapsed to the floor, his eyes rolling back. I ran to check his pulse. He was still alive, but unconscious. "James!" Sarah called, her voice urgent. "Look!" I followed her gaze and saw something that made my heart freeze. Across the street, getting out of a black van, were the same men in suits we had seen at Mr. Hargrove's house, and they were coming towards us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand. We ran through the chaotic streets of Whitefall, dodging disoriented people and obstacles. The men in suits pursued us relentlessly, their footsteps echoing menacingly behind us. We turned a corner and almost collided with a familiar figure, Mia. Her eyes were shining with a strange light, and she seemed strangely calm in the midst of the chaos. "This way," she said, gesturing to a side door of an old building. Without hesitation, we followed her. The inside of the building was dark and dusty, full of old machines and work tables. It looked like an old textile factory. "What is this place?" I asked, panting. "A refuge," Mia replied enigmatically, "and perhaps our only hope of fixing it." She led us through the maze of machines until we reached a back room. To my surprise, Mr. Hargrove was there, alive and apparently well. "Mr. Hargrove," Sarah exclaimed, "we thought something terrible had happened to you." The old librarian smiled sadly. "Something terrible has happened to all of us, my dear. But perhaps now we can do something about it." Mia closed the door behind us and turned around, her eyes shining with a supernatural intensity. "What you activated in the underground base wasn't just a reversal pulse," she explained. "It was the trigger for the final phase of Project Echo." I felt my stomach sink. "What do you mean?" The real aim of the project, Mr. Hargrove continued, was not just to control people's minds, but to merge them into one collective consciousness. What we're seeing out there is just the initial stage of that process. Sarah gasped, horrified. So what can we do to stop it? Mia approached a table covered in papers and strange devices. There is a way, she said, picking up what looked like a small transmitter. But it's risky, and we'll need help from all of you. As Mia explained the plan, I couldn't help feeling that we were on the verge of something monumental. The fate of Whitefall, and perhaps the world, was in our hands. Outside, we could hear the chaos continuing, screams and cries mixed with the constant hum in the air. The lights in the sky pulsed more intensely, as if responding to the turmoil below. "We don't have much time," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice urgent. "The synchronization is accelerating. If we don't act now, it could be too late." I looked at Sarah, seeing in her the same determination I felt. We nodded at each other, ready for whatever came next. "Right," I said, turning to Mia and Mr. Hargrove. "What do we need to do?" Mia began distributing the strange devices among us. "These transmitters are designed to interrupt the synchronization signal," she explained. "We need to position them at key points around the city." "But there's a problem," Mr. Hargrove interjected. "For them to work effectively, someone needs to be at the center of the synchronization pulse to, say, redirect it." "And where is that center?" Sarah asked, although I suspected we all already knew the answer. "The underground base," Mia confirmed, her eyes meeting mine. "And it has to be you, James." I felt the weight of that responsibility fall on my shoulders. Part of me wanted to refuse, to run away from that nightmare. But looking at the people around me, Sarah, Mia, Mr. Hargrove, I knew I had no choice. "All right," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "I'll do it." Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I won't let you go alone," she said. Before we could discuss it further, a deafening crash shook the building. Pieces of dust and plaster fell from the ceiling. "They've found us," Mr. Hargrove said, his face pale with fear. Mia quickly pushed us towards a back door. "Go!" she shouted. "Position the transmitters. We'll slow them down." "But—" I started to protest. "There's no time for argument. James," Mia cut me off, her eyes blazing with a force I'd never seen before. "The future of Whitefall depends on you now." With one last look at my sister and Mr. Hargrove, Sarah and I ran out into the chaotic Whitefall night. The sky above pulsed with impossible colors, and the air vibrated with an energy that made my teeth ache. As we ran through the streets, positioning the transmitters in the places indicated by Mia, I couldn't help but think about what awaited us in the underground base. Whatever the outcome, I knew that our journey was coming to an end, and as the night progressed, laden with screams, strange lights, and the constant hum of synchronization, I wondered if Whitefall, and all of us, would ever be the same again. The air vibrated with an almost palpable energy as Sarah and I approached the mine entrance. The sky above Whitefall was a kaleidoscope of impossible colors, pulsing in sync with the hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Every step towards the underground base was a struggle against an invisible force that seemed to want to repel us. "James," Sarah whispered, her face pale in the strange light. "Do you feel that?" I nodded, unable to find words to describe the sensation of being pulled in 1,000 different directions at once. It was as if every mind in Whitefall was trying to connect with mine, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions that threatened to drag me into oblivion. We reached the entrance to the mine, the symbol carved into the rock now glowing with a light of its own. I exchanged one last look with Sarah before touching the symbol. The rock wall slid aside, revealing the metal corridor that led deep into the earth. "Remember the plan," I said, my voice hoarse. "You need to make sure all the transmitters are active on the surface." Sarah nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "And you have to get to the synchronization core. James, please, be careful." We hugged briefly, the physical contact providing a moment of clarity amidst the mental chaos that surrounded us. Then, with a final nod, I turned and entered the corridor, leaving Sarah behind. The descent into the underground base was a surreal journey. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The hum intensified with every step, reverberating through the metal and my bones. Finally, I reached the central room, the heart of the Project Echo operation. The glass chamber in the center of the room now pulsed with the same strange light that illuminated the Whitefall sky. Inside it, a figure floated in a glowing liquid. With a jolt of recognition, I realized it was Mr. Hargrove. "Welcome, James Anderson," a familiar voice echoed through the room. "We've been expecting you." I turned to see Dr. Reeves emerging from the shadows, his face a mask of uneasy calm. Next to him stood Mia, her eyes shining with that supernatural light. "Mia?" I gasped, betrayal cutting deep. "How?" "Oh, James," Mia smiled, her voice strangely distant. "Don't you get it yet? This is evolution, the next step for humanity." Reeves stepped forward, his eyes fixed on me with a feverish intensity. "Project Echo isn't about control, James. It's about unity. Imagine a world where everyone is connected, where there is no more loneliness, no more conflict, no more fear of the unknown." "At the cost of our individuality?" I retorted, struggling to keep my thoughts coherent amid the growing buzz. "Our free will?" "Free will," Mia laughed softly. "An illusion, brother. Our choices have always been shaped by forces beyond our control. At least now, we can choose harmony." As they spoke, I slowly approached the control panel near the central chamber. If I could only reach it. "Not so fast," Reeves said, pulling out a gun. "Do you really think you can stop the inevitable?" Just then, an explosion shook the base. The lights flickered and, for an instant, the buzzing ceased. Sarah had managed to activate the transmitters on the surface. Taking advantage of the distraction, I launched myself towards the control panel. Reeves fired, the bullet grazing my shoulder. The pain exploded, but I managed to reach the panel. Mia screamed, a sound that seemed to contain the voices of all of Whitefall. She advanced towards me, her movements inhumanly fast. But before she could reach me, I activated the sequence that Mia, the real Mia, had taught me. The effect was instantaneous. The central chamber exploded in a cascade of light, the glowing liquid spreading across the floor. Mr. Hargrove collapsed, coughing and gasping. A deafening scream echoed through the base, a cacophony of thousands of voices breaking up simultaneously. Reeves fell to his knees, dropping his gun and clutching his head in agony. Mia, or whatever was controlling Mia, lay writhing on the ground, her body shaking violently. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The humming ceased, leaving a deafening silence in its place. The strange lights went out, plunging the room into the dimness of the emergency lights. I staggered over to Mr. Hargrove, helping him to his feet. "Are you finished?" he asked, and his voice weak. "I think so," I replied, still not daring to believe it. Mia stirred, blinking in confusion. "James," she murmured, her voice back to normal. What happened?" Before I could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Sarah appeared in the doorway, panting and with a cut on her forehead, but alive. "It worked," she exclaimed, running to hug us. "The transmitters, they've broken synchronization." Over the next few minutes, which seemed like hours, we regrouped and did what we could to ensure that Project Echo was truly over. Reeves, still conscious but clearly shaken, was tied up and left under Mr. Hargrove's watch while we scoured the base for any remaining information. Finally, exhausted and still dazed by everything that had happened, we emerged from the mine to a new dawn in Whitefall. The sky was clear, the familiar winter blue replacing the impossible colors of the night before. In the streets, the inhabitants of Whitefall wandered around confused, many crying, others hugging each other in silence. It was as if the whole town was waking up from a long and terrible nightmare. In the weeks that followed, the truth about Project Echo came out. There were investigations, arrests, tears and recriminations, but there was also healing. Slowly, painfully, Whitefall began to rebuild. Maya, free from the influence of the project, became instrumental in the city's recovery process. Her ability to understand and navigate the traumas shared by the inhabitants was invaluable. Sarah took on the leadership of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, working tirelessly to ensure that nothing like Project Eco could ever happen again. As for me, I found an uneasy peace. The scars of what we had experienced would remain forever, but there was also a sense of renewed purpose. Whitefall was my home, and I had helped save it. On a cold afternoon, months after the events in the underground base, I found myself in the city cemetery again. This time, I wasn't alone. Sarah was by my side, her hand firmly in mine. Looking at my family's gravestones, I felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude. They hadn't lived to see Whitefall free, but their sacrifice hadn't been in vain. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked softly. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. "About echoes," I replied. "About how our actions, our choices, continue to reverberate long after we've made them." Sarah nodded, her eyes distant. "Like the echoes of snow." "Yes," I agreed. "But now, those echoes are ours. Not imposed, not controlled, but freely chosen." As the sun set over Whitefall, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt a sense of hope that I hadn't experienced for years. The future was uncertain, but it was ours to shape. The echoes of the past would always be with us, but now, finally, we could choose which ones we wanted to hear. And at that moment, standing in the cemetery with Sarah, I chose to listen to the echoes of hope, healing, and a new beginning. Whitefall had survived its darkest night, and now, together, we would walk towards the light of a new day.